7 years have passed since the Watts family tragedy, yet the disturbing details remain etched in public memory. The case continues to spark debate, speculation, and deep unease across online communities and investigative circles alike. And despite the convictions, one question remains. Welcome to Secret Crime HQ, your ultimate destination for gripping true crime stories. We uncover hidden truths, explore cold cases, and dive deep into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to join our community. Why does this case still feel unresolved? What keeps it alive in the collective consciousness? It's not just the horror of the crime itself. It's the complex web of silence, deceit, and the questions surrounding a woman whose name is now intertwined with this tragedy. Nichol Kessinger. Before the world knew Chris Watts as a murderer, he was simply another face in a crowd. A devoted husband, a proud father, and a man seemingly living the American dream. He had it all. A wife, 2 young daughters, and a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. To those looking in from the outside, Chris had crafted a perfect life. His social media posts, often shared by his wife, Shannon, painted a picture of family vacations, birthday parties, and family smiles, all punctuated with expressions of love and joy. Their life was one that others envied. A balanced, happy home with everything in place. Yet behind the camera lens, the cracks in this image were already beginning to form. Those who were closest to Chris saw the subtle signs, the increasing emotional distance between him and Shannon, the quiet tension that simmered just below the surface. For Chris, the pressure of maintaining the perfect image was suffocating. His life, once a model of stability, was beginning to unravel in ways no one could yet see. Shannon's health issues, combined with the struggles of raising 2 young children and the financial pressures of their life, created stress that neither of them had the tools to handle. Their marriage, once full of promise, was now strained with each passing day, making it more difficult to bridge the growing gap between them. Chris, however, remained outwardly calm and composed. He kept up appearances, showing the world the version of himself that was the devoted father and husband. He participated in family events, in social media updates, but internally he was becoming more and more disconnected. His frustrations began to build, but instead of confronting them head-on, he withdrew further into himself, bearing his emotions and his dissatisfaction beneath a mask of normalcy. As Chris continued to hide his discontent, he found himself in the middle of a narrative that was beginning to shift in his mind. He started to romanticize the idea of a new life, one where he could escape the pressures of his family and live on his own terms. But to get there, he needed someone who could see him differently, someone who wouldn't judge him for the choices he had made. Nichol Kessinger was a woman looking for a fresh start. She had recently gone through a tough breakup, and like many, she was searching for someone who could fill the emptiness that had been left in her life. Chris, with his charming demeanor and smooth words, appeared to be the answer. She met him at work, and their initial conversation centered around casual exchanges, getting to know one another, sharing stories of life, love, and past relationships. Chris presented himself as a man who was just as imperfect as she was, a man with a troubled marriage who needed someone to talk to. From the very beginning, Chris made sure to present the narrative of his troubled relationship with Shannon. He spoke of their struggles, painting Shannon as the source of his discontent, the one who was emotionally distant and demanding. He framed himself as the victim of a marriage that had long since turned stale, a man looking for change, for a way out of the emotional and physical strain he was experiencing. It wasn't just a marriage that had lost its spark. It was a life that had grown unbearable, and Chris was looking for someone to help him escape it. For Nichol, this story struck a chord. She understood the pain of feeling stuck, of wanting something more from life, but being afraid of the consequences of taking that step. Chris seemed like a man who had the same desires for change. She found herself drawn to him, his vulnerability, his promises of a new beginning, his assurance that things could be different. She believed in his narrative, and she wanted to be the person who could help him heal. Little did she know, The man she was falling for had already begun constructing a life built on lies. As their relationship deepened, so did the web of deception Chris had woven around Nichol. At first, it felt like an escape for both of them, a brief respite from their respective lives. For Chris, it was a chance to break free from the tension and responsibility of his home life, a way to enjoy the attention and affection that had been lacking in his marriage. For Nichol, it was a chance to be with someone who seemed emotionally available, who seemed to understand her desires for a fresh start. But as the relationship progressed, the cracks in Chris's story began to show. Nichol began to notice inconsistencies in his words and actions, small details that didn't add up, things that didn't match the picture he painted of his troubled marriage. But Chris was too skilled at keeping up appearances. His charm, his ability to deflect, and his carefully crafted persona kept her from seeing the full truth. When Nichol asked questions or voiced doubts, Chris was quick to reassure her, painting the picture of a man just waiting for the right moment to break free from a toxic situation. Meanwhile, Chris's secret life continued to grow. He was no longer just looking for affection or emotional support. He was looking for a way out. Nichol was unaware of the emotional depth of his dissatisfaction with his family, nor was she aware of the darker thoughts he was beginning to entertain. His desire for freedom was not just about escaping Shannon. It was about escaping the life he had built, the responsibilities he no longer wanted to bear. Nichol's love for him became an integral part of his escape plan, a necessary element in his pursuit of a new life. And so their relationship deepened, their connection becoming more intense and emotional. But as Chris found solace in Nichol's arms, the lies continued to build. For him, this wasn't just an affair. It was his chance to reinvent himself, to craft a life without the burden of his past. For Nichol, this was an opportunity to finally find the love and connection she had been craving. But the truth was that both were trapped. Nichol was unknowingly complicit in Chris's deception, and Chris was beginning to sink deeper into the lies he had created. He had built a life based on fantasy, a world where he could escape his past. But the price of that escape would be much higher than anyone could have predicted. As the relationship progressed, the weight of their involvement would become more apparent, especially when the illusion of the perfect family began to crack and the truth about Chris Watts came crashing down. As Chris and Nichol's relationship blossomed, so did the cracks in the facade he had so carefully constructed. At first, everything seemed to fall into place. As Chris continued to paint the picture of a man desperate for change, trapped in a marriage that no longer made sense to him. He was the one who needed a fresh start, and Nichol was the one who could offer him that. For a time, it seemed perfect. She became his confidant, the one person who could make him feel alive again, far from the pressure of his family life. But slowly, the inconsistencies in Chris's story began to surface. Little things at first, comments that didn't match his previous explanations, small details that didn't align with the picture of the troubled husband he portrayed. He spoke often about his desire to leave Shannon, about the emotional distance in their marriage. But as their relationship deepened, Nichol started noticing that Chris's actions didn't always back up his words. The more they spent time together, the more she realized how often he seemed distracted, almost as if he was mentally somewhere else. He would talk about how he was so unhappy at home. But when Nichol would ask about their family dynamics, Chris's answers were vague, evasive. He seemed reluctant to really discuss Shannon, instead focusing on how he couldn't wait for things to be different. His descriptions of his home life felt rehearsed, and yet Nichol's growing concerns were brushed aside as nothing more than misunderstandings. There were moments when Chris's behavior raised red flags. His reluctance to answer certain questions, his sudden emotional withdrawal, his need for constant reassurance. But every time Nichol noticed these discrepancies, she chalked them up to his own struggles, his emotional exhaustion from the stress of his marriage. After all, he was the one in a bad marriage, not her. He was the one making the sacrifices, the one who needed help and support. She couldn't imagine that someone she trusted so deeply would be hiding anything serious. Despite her lingering doubts, she chose to ignore the warning signs. She was falling for Chris. And in doing so, she allowed herself to believe the narrative he had created. A narrative where he was a victim, someone who deserved a second chance at happiness. The growing distance between his words and actions became a minor irritation, something she believed they could work through. But it wasn't long before the truth began to seep through the cracks of the perfect image Chris had so carefully crafted. One evening, the weight of the truth came crashing down. Nichols, still fully immersed in the relationship and hoping for a future with Chris, stumbled upon something that forced her to confront the lie she had been living. It wasn't one dramatic moment, but rather a series of small, uncomfortable realizations that piled up until they couldn't be ignored anymore. It started with a casual conversation about his marriage, one of many in which Chris had spoken about the strain he was under, the emotional distance between him and Shannon. But this time something felt off. When Nichol asked more pointed questions, Chris became defensive, his answers evasive in a way that was more than just frustration. He seemed guarded, uncomfortable with the topic in a way that was unusual. As Nichol pushed for clarity, she began to see the cracks in Chris's version of his life. His details started to change. His explanations didn't add up. And something in his eyes, a fleeting look, a moment of discomfort, told her that perhaps he wasn't being as honest as she thought. The realization hit hard when she discovered a set of photos on Chris's phone. She had always known he was married, but these pictures painted a different story, a more intimate one that contradicted everything he had told her about his unhappy marriage. Photos of Chris with his children, a loving father, filled the screen. And as she scrolled, it became apparent that this was not a man desperate to escape his life, but a man deeply embedded in it. The confusion hit her like a wave. She had been so sure of him, so convinced that he was a victim of a life he didn't want. But now, the truth seemed so much more complicated. The lies, the contradictions, everything she had been led to believe now seemed fragile, full of holes. She was no longer just involved in a relationship with a man trying to rebuild his life. She was tangled in a web of deceit that went far deeper than she had imagined. Nichol's heart sank as she processed the full scope of what she was facing. She felt betrayed not only by Chris, but also by herself for not seeing the signs sooner. She had allowed herself to believe his stories, to fall for a version of events that now seemed almost laughable. But it wasn't just the shock of betrayal that hurt. It was the overwhelming sense of responsibility that began to sink in. How could she have been so blind? How had she become so involved with someone whose life was built on a foundation of lies? In that moment, Nichol realized the extent of her involvement. She wasn't just another woman in Chris's life. She was part of the larger lie he had created, a lie that now stretched to encompass his family, his marriage, and his own moral compass. The weight of this truth pressed down on her, leaving her feeling lost and confused. Could she still trust the man she had fallen for? Or had she been nothing more than an escape for someone who was unwilling to confront his own failures? The question loomed large. How had she become part of this narrative, this story of deception, without even realizing it? As the truth settled in, Nichol was left to grapple with the overwhelming realization that the life she had been building with Chris was based on nothing but a perfect illusion. The day the news broke that Chris Watts was arrested for the murder of his wife, Shannon, and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, it felt as though the earth itself had tilted beneath Nichol Kessinger's feet. The man she had come to trust, the man she had built an emotional connection with, was now a convicted murderer. The reality of it was surreal, almost impossible to grasp. As the news flashed across every screen and filled the airwaves, Nichol could only stare in disbelief. For months, she had listened to Chris's side of the story, the tale of a man trapped in a loveless marriage, struggling under the weight of responsibilities he could no longer bear. She had been his confidant, his emotional escape, the one person who believed in his dream of starting over. But now the truth shattered every illusion she had held. Chris Watts wasn't just an unhappy husband, he was a cold-blooded killer. Nichol was thrust into the eye of a storm. Media outlets began to swarm her personal life, bombarding her with questions. How much did she know? Was she involved? Had she been a part of the larger plan? For days, these questions swirled around her, and she found herself haunted by a chilling realization. Had she somehow played a role in this tragedy? Had her relationship with Chris, her emotional support for him, pushed him further into his dark descent? Despite her insistence that she was just another victim of Chris's lies, Nichol couldn't help but wonder, was she complicit in some way? Could she have seen the signs and ignored them? Was she manipulated, or did she fail to recognize the danger that lurked behind Chris's charm? The lines between victim and perpetrator became increasingly blurred in her mind. She was now part of a story that had nothing to do with the fresh start she had imagined. Instead, she was caught in the wreckage of a crime so horrific that no amount of distance or silence could ever erase her association with it. The arrest was the breaking point, but the confusion and the questions it raised were only just beginning. Emotional fallout. Nichol's life, once filled with the hope of a new relationship, was now consumed by guilt, shame, and public scrutiny. The arrest of Chris Watts didn't just mark the end of her relationship with him. It turned her entire world upside down. No longer a woman seeking love and companionship, she was now thrust into a scandal that involved the most brutal of crimes. The press and the public turned their gaze on her, scrutinizing every word, every action, and every decision she had made in the months leading up to the murders. The weight of it all felt unbearable. Nichol had never asked for any of this. She had simply been a woman caught up in a relationship, deceived by a man who promised her a future and a new beginning. Now she was left grappling with the fallout of those promises. The guilt of having been involved with a man who could commit such an atrocity consumed her. She wondered if she should have seen something sooner, if there had been warning signs she had missed. Should she have asked more questions? Should she have taken a closer look at his behavior, his actions, the inconsistencies in his story? The shame weighed heavily on her. As the world looked on, Nichol found herself withdrawing, retreating into silence. She shut out the noise of the media, the questions from friends and family, and the growing pressure from the public. She had once believed in Chris's narrative, and now she was left to question everything, her judgment, her trust in him, and the very choices that had led her here. Nichol tried to disappear from the public eye. She erased her social media profiles, turned off her phone, and sought refuge in her own thoughts, trying to process the overwhelming sense of betrayal and confusion. The world seemed to be watching her every move, expecting answers she didn't have. She wanted to hide from the world's judgment, to escape from the relentless scrutiny. But the truth was, there was nowhere to hide. In her moments of solitude, she felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the life she had imagined with Chris, but for the person she had become. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. And now she was left in the wreckage of that trust, questioning her role in a tragedy she never could have foreseen. The emotional fallout was devastating. Nichol couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow been complicit in a chain of events that led to the senseless deaths of an innocent woman and her 2 young children. The silence she sought became her only refuge. But even that couldn't shield her from the endless barrage of questions, the judgment of a world that didn't fully understand her involvement. As the case continued to unfold, Nichol remained in the shadows. Unable to escape the weight of her past decisions, she was left with the unrelenting question: how much of this tragedy was her fault? How much of it had been a result of her emotional connection with Chris? The silence around her was deafening, but the guilt never stopped whispering, lingering in the corners of her mind, refusing to let her rest. This chapter focuses on the devastating emotional aftermath of Chris's arrest as Nichol grapples with guilt, confusion, and the public's invasive scrutiny. Her life, which once seemed to be filled with promise and a fresh start, now feels like a world turned upside down. As she retreats into silence, the heavy burden of her involvement in the story looms large, leaving her to question her role in the tragedy. Even though Nichol Kessinger had been cleared of any direct involvement in the brutal murders of Shannon and her daughters Bella and Celeste, she could not escape the suffocating grip of public curiosity. The world was fascinated by her, captivated by the mystery of her connection to Chris Watts. She had been thrust into the spotlight after the tragedy, and the public wanted answers. answers that she was unwilling or unable to give. Despite the legal assurances that she was not involved in the crime, the speculation continued to swirl. Was she more involved than she admitted? Did she have knowledge of Chris's plans, of the extent of his deceit? The questions seemed to grow louder with each passing day. People who once sympathized with her now questioned her motives, while others saw her as just another player in a much larger, more sinister drama. The media, always hungry for sensational stories, turned Nichol into a figure of intense scrutiny. Every interview she gave, every post on social media, if she even dared to appear online, was dissected by the public. Rumors spread like wildfire, with some claiming she had been complicit, while others speculated that she was a victim of Chris's manipulation. Some even questioned her silence, asking why she hadn't spoken up sooner, why she hadn't told her side of the story in the wake of the tragedy. In an era of public figures constantly speaking out, Nichol's refusal to do so only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Nichol, however, remained silent. She withdrew from the world, seeking refuge and anonymity, away from the prying eyes of a society that was too eager to pass judgment. She knew the spotlight would not fade easily, but every moment she spent in the public eye felt like another violation. Her silence, once a choice for personal healing, soon became a refuge, a shield against the invasive questions and the relentless pressure. But despite her best efforts to disappear, the case and her role in it refused to fade into the background. The public's insatiable curiosity turned her into a symbol of something larger than herself. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what she represented in the wake of Chris Watts's horrific actions. People wanted closure, and her silence seemed like the final piece of the puzzle they were desperate to solve. She became the missing link, the woman who knew something but chose not to speak. And every time she stayed quiet, the speculation grew louder: hiding or healing? The question that echoed through Nichol's mind was the same one the public asked. Why did she retreat? Why had she disappeared from the media, the very place where answers could be found? Was her silence born out of shame, a reaction to the guilt of being associated with such a horrific crime? Or was there something deeper? Something about the weight of her own emotional turmoil and the fear of facing a world that could no longer see her as just a woman in love, but as a symbol of betrayal. As the weeks turned to months and months into years, Nichol's retreat became a story in itself. She remained in hiding, avoiding public appearances, evading interviews, and steering clear of the media spotlight. Her silence spoke volumes. It was an attempt at self-preservation, a strategy to shield herself from a world that was quick to label her as either a co-conspirator or an innocent victim. But was it really about hiding from others? Or was it more about protecting herself from the truths she could no longer ignore? For Nichol, the shame she felt was overwhelming. She was connected to a crime so horrific that it shook a nation. Even though she wasn't involved in the murders, she could not erase the fact that she had played a role in Chris Watts's life at a time when he was planning to end his family's life. She had been part of his story, the woman who had believed in him, who had seen him as someone deserving of a second chance. But now that belief seemed naive at best and complicit at worst. Could she ever forgive herself for becoming entangled with someone so dangerous? The weight of guilt was heavy, but there was more to her retreat than just shame. There was also fear of how the world would judge her, fear of facing the public scrutiny that would never go away. In the silence, Nichol found a semblance of peace, a way to escape the relentless bombardment of questions, rumors, and accusations. It was easier to remain hidden than to face the people who believed she had something to hide. Every time she considered speaking out, the fear of being misunderstood, misjudged, or accused of something she didn't do held her back. Her silence also became a defense mechanism. If she could disappear from the public eye, maybe the world would forget about her connection to the tragedy. Maybe she could finally begin to heal, to rebuild her life without the constant reminder of the man who had shattered everything. But the question remained, could she truly heal in silence? Or had her refusal to speak out created an internal prison, one that left her perpetually haunted by the events she had been a part of, even if unknowingly? For Nichol, the choice to retreat wasn't just about avoiding the public. It was about trying to regain control over a situation she never should have been part of. But the more she hid, the more the questions lingered. What was she hiding from? And what was she hiding within herself? As her silence continued, the answers became more elusive, not just to the public but to Nichol herself. The world may have speculated endlessly about her role in the tragedy, but the truth was Nichol didn't have the answers anyone wanted. She was hiding from more than just the spotlight. She was hiding from herself, from the shame, the confusion, and the uncertainty of what her life had become. And in that silence, she struggled to find peace. Never fully understanding the consequences of her decisions, never fully able to escape the shadow of a crime that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This chapter delves into Nichol Kessinger's emotional retreat from the world, exploring her inner turmoil, the growing public fascination with her involvement, and her struggle to find solace in the midst of the chaos. The questions about why she chose to hide remain unanswered, leaving her journey one of self-reflection and isolation. The silence that once felt like a shield against judgment becomes a prison in its own right. Nichol Kessinger's decision to retreat from the public eye after Chris Watts's arrest only served to intensify the obsession surrounding her. Her silence became a focal point for everyone: media outlets, amateur detectives, and even the public at large. The more she withdrew from the spotlight, the more people seemed to crave her story. What did she know? How much had she been involved? Was she complicit or a victim herself? Every movement, every word she spoke was scrutinized and dissected, as though she held the final piece to a puzzle that could make sense of an otherwise senseless tragedy. By staying silent, Nichol had unknowingly fed the flames of curiosity. Her absence became a blank space in the narrative, one that people were desperate to fill. Interviews with friends, family members, and even ex-colleagues were dissected for any mention of her involvement. Every time a new detail emerged, no matter how small, people latched onto it, hoping it would give them the clarity they so desperately sought. But no amount of speculation could change the reality. Nichol had chosen silence, and that silence only deepened the mystery. Her story became a side note in the Watts case, something that others picked apart to understand Chris's motivations, his relationships, and the trajectory of his final deadly actions. Her silence gave her power, but also trapped her in a never-ending cycle of public fascination. She became the final enigma in a case that everyone believed had been solved. Yet, her absence kept the door to new questions open. The obsession wasn't just about solving the case. It was about filling the gaps. As the world continued to dissect every tiny detail of the Watts family's tragic end, Nichol remained a figure who was constantly out of reach. The absence of her perspective, the missing piece that could have explained her role, her feelings, her involvement, only served to feed the speculation, creating a storyline that lived in the shadows. The obsession with Nichol Kessinger became something more than curiosity. It became an addiction to the unknown, the weight of unanswered questions. The Watts case should have been closed. Chris Watts was in prison, sentenced for the brutal murder of his wife and children, and the legal proceedings were over. But still, the case lingered in the collective consciousness because it wasn't just about what had been proven. It was about what remained unanswered. The lingering questions about Nichol Kessinger, her relationship with Chris, and the real reasons behind his actions continued to gnaw at the public, refusing to let the case settle into the past. There was a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that the full truth had not been revealed. Nichol, by choosing to remain silent, became a symbol of that incompleteness. The public wanted closure, but it wasn't just about justice. It was about understanding why everything had gone wrong. People couldn't help but wonder, how did it all spiral out of control so quickly? Could Chris Watts have been stopped? Was there something more in his relationship with Nichol that could explain the depths of his betrayal? The obsession wasn't about finding justice for Shannon and her children anymore. It was about piecing together the mystery of what had truly happened. This obsession wasn't just driven by a desire for answers. It was driven by a need to fill in the blanks. As human beings, we crave understanding. We need to know why things happen, what motivates people, and how everything connects. The Watts case, despite its horrific nature, became an intellectual puzzle for the world to solve. And with Nichol remaining silent, that puzzle could never be completed. She became the missing piece, the one person who could potentially explain the cracks in the story, yet refused to speak. Nichol's silence created a void that made people uncomfortable. It was easier to speculate, to create theories about her involvement, than to sit with the uncomfortable truth that some questions may never have clear answers. The fact that Chris's motivations in Nichol's role remained murky only made the case more fascinating to the public. They wanted to understand the psychology behind the tragedy. How could someone who appeared so normal, so likable, become a killer? And why was Nichol silent? What was she hiding, if anything? But in reality, the longer the case lingered in the public eye, the further the truth seemed to slip away. The story of the Watts family, once filled with vibrant smiles, family milestones, and public celebrations, had now become a twisted narrative that people couldn't help but replay. But the more the case was dissected, the more it seemed to slip through the cracks, leaving a trail of uncertainty. Could the truth about Chris Watts, his marriage, and his connection to Nichol ever truly be known? Was there a reason for his actions that we could understand? Or was it simply the work of a man so far detached from reality that no answer could make sense? In the years since the crime, the case has not faded. It lives on, not because the justice system failed, but because the story itself is incomplete. The truth remains elusive, hiding behind a veil of silence, unanswered questions, and unanswered motives. And as long as Nichol's silence continues, the fascination will persist. People will keep asking, keep searching, and keep speculating, and the haunting truth may never fully come to light. This chapter focuses on the lasting impact of Nichol's silence and the unanswered questions that continue to fuel the public's obsession with the Watts case. The absence of definitive answers creates a sense of discomfort and unease, forcing people to search for meaning in places where none may exist. The weight of those unanswered questions leaves the case unresolved in the public eye. Nichol, in her quiet retreat, remains a central figure in that ongoing search for truth. 7 years after the murders of Shannon Watts and her 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, the case still lingers in the public eye, captivating the world's attention with its many unanswered questions. Most criminal cases fade over time, their details relegated to the past as the headlines move on to new stories. But the Watts case refuses to dissipate into obscurity. Instead, it endures in online forums, documentaries, podcasts, and social media discussions. Why does this case still haunt us when others have long since faded? Why are we still drawn to a tragedy that seems on the surface to have been resolved? The answer lies not just in the horror of the crime, but in the questions that remain. Who was Chris Watts really? How could a man who appeared so ordinary, so devoted to his family, commit such an atrocity? What role did Nichol Kessinger play in the story? Was she simply a victim of Chris's lies? Or was there something more to her involvement? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what happened in the days and weeks leading up to the murders that we still don't know? What unsettles the public is not just the knowledge that Chris is in prison serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The unsettling truth is that even after all this time, the full story has not been told. Despite the confessions, the trial, and the overwhelming evidence, there are still gaps, unanswered questions, and inconsistencies that leave the story incomplete. In a world where answers are so often sought, the Watts case endures because it remains an unsolved puzzle. Emotionally, if not legally, we crave closure. Yet it always seems just out of reach. Every new piece of evidence, every new perspective offered seems to uncover more complexities rather than bringing us closer to the final full truth. For some, the fascination is not just about understanding what happened on that fateful night in August 2018, but about understanding the human mind, the psychological factors that could drive a seemingly loving husband and father to murder his family. For others, it's about the haunting questions of betrayal, deception, and the lies that spiraled out of control. In the case of Chris Watts, there's still more to discover, and the truth feels like it could still be waiting to be uncovered, hidden beneath layers of silence and misdirection. The legacy of silence. As the years pass, Shannon and her daughters remain frozen in time, captured in the digital moments they left behind. Videos of family celebrations, photographs of birthdays and holidays, and posts full of hope and joy, once filled with the promise of a bright future, now serve as haunting reminders of what was lost. These digital echoes, once symbols of a thriving family, now carry an unbearable weight. For those who love Shannon and her children, their memory is a wound that never heals, a constant reminder of the brutality that took them from this world too soon. In the digital age where every moment is captured and immortalized, Shannon's Facebook page remains a testament to the life she lived. A life filled with love, joy, and the hopes of a woman who had just begun a new chapter. But for those left behind, every scroll through her posts, every video of her smiling and interacting with her children is like reopening a wound that time cannot heal. Her presence lingers not just in the memory of her loved ones, but in the never-ending stream of her online existence. And for Shannon's family, the pain of losing her is compounded by the fact that her final moments, her last days with Chris, remain clouded in suspicion and unanswered questions. But it's not just Shannon's memory that endures. Chris Watts's punishment is not confined to his prison cell. His true sentence lies in the endless replay of the story he tried so hard to hide. The truth that continues to haunt him is not just the fact of his crime, but the way it has consumed his life, the lives of his victims, and the world that continues to watch. Chris is isolated in a prison cell, but his life is still defined by the tragedy he created. His story, one that he tried to control and manipulate, continues to unfold before the public eye. His confession, his attempts to deflect blame, his portrayal of his marriage as a burden. These things continue to be examined, scrutinized, and re-examined by those who cannot look away. He is a man who sought to escape responsibility, but the punishment he faces is not just in the form of his sentence. It is in the unrelenting replay of the life he destroyed. For Chris, the truth is no longer something he can control. It has become a force that surrounds him, a reminder of what he did, a punishment that plays out daily in the public eye. Every conversation about the case, every documentary, every social media post about Shannon and her daughters is another reminder of the lives he took and the lies he told. As time goes on, the case that once shocked the nation continues to cast its shadow. The obsession with the Watts family, the questions about Chris's motives, and the unresolved silence around Nichol Kessinger's role will not fade. The tragic story that began in a quiet suburban home in Colorado has become a modern-day spectacle, an obsession that refuses to die. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the constant unraveling of a story that is never truly finished. The truth remains elusive, but it is the very absence of that truth, the inability to fully understand the events that transpired, that ensures the Watts case will continue to captivate and haunt for years to come. This chapter focuses on the lingering emotional and societal impact of the Watts case, emphasizing how the case continues to captivate public attention, not just because of the crime itself, but due to the unanswered questions and the silence that surrounds it. Shannon's legacy and Chris's ongoing punishment through the scrutiny of his actions ensure that this tragedy will remain in the public consciousness. The case endures as a reminder of the fragility of perception and the difficulty of understanding the true nature of evil. The Watts case, despite the passage of time, refuses to fade into the shadows of history. We are left not with closure, but with a sense of lingering incompleteness. The details of the crime, the motives behind Chris Watts's actions, and the role of Nichol Kessinger remain unanswered, fueling our collective obsession with the case. As the years stretch on, the thirst for understanding only grows more intense. There are too many questions, too many uncertainties that prevent this story from being fully understood. Nichol Kessinger's role in this tragedy is perhaps the most enigmatic. Her silence, her retreat from the public eye, and the speculation surrounding her connection to Chris Watts have only added layers to the mystery. Was she merely a victim of his manipulation, or was there more to her involvement than we'll ever know? Was she a woman deceived by a charming, troubled man, or was she complicit in something far darker? These unanswered questions continue to fuel the public's curiosity, adding a sense of intrigue to an already complex case. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that we have unanswered questions. It's that we may never know the full truth. Despite the confessions, the trials, and the widespread media coverage, the heart of this story remains shrouded in mystery. Even when the legal case is closed, the emotional and psychological questions persist. The more we try to dissect the lives of the people involved, the more we realize how much we don't know. We may never understand all the motivations, the hidden emotions, or the dark secrets that led to such an unfathomable act. The tragedy of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico continues to haunt not just their family, but the world at large. They are not just victims of a man's rage. They are symbols of the shadows that linger in every corner of this case. Their lives captured in pictures and videos now serve as reminders of what was lost in what we are still trying to understand. And Chris Watts behind bars remains trapped in the consequences of his actions, but also in the truth that he has yet to fully reveal. This case refuses to be forgotten because it has become a reflection of something deeper. The human need to understand, to seek closure, and the fear that sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we may never know the full story. The questions keep coming. The ghosts of the past remain, and the obsession with the Watts case and all its unresolved layers continues to grow. As we try to make sense of the tragedy, we are left with a chilling thought. What if we never truly know the full truth? The Watts story may be over in the courtroom, but for those who continue to search for answers, it is far from finished. It is a story that will echo in our minds for years to come, leaving us to wonder if the truth will ever fully emerge from the shadows.